All right, welcome back. We're looking at the impact of feudalism. Last, we talked about feudalism in the society and how it was ordered. If you recall, we have the Pope at the very top above everyone else, kind of separate from the pyramid. Then you have your king, then you have your lords, and your below your lords, your knights, your vassals, below them, your shopkeepers, kind of everyday middle class people. And below them, you have your serfs and your peasants. So, feudalism totally restructured society, obviously. It lasted for over 500 years. This was how people lived. It is the reason Europe did not see a great unified government for so long, because there wasn't any unified government. The king wasn't truly in power. The person who had power was the person who had the most land. As long as you had land, you were doing pretty good. So, feudalism is major when we talk about the Middle Ages. So, knights have a great prestige in the Middle Ages as well. Like you probably have heard of Sir Lancelot as being one of the most famous knights, kind of like the epitome of what a knight should be. So knights had the social prestige and very few responsibilities other than to fight and protect. If you wanted to be a knight, you couldn't just decide you wanted to be a knight. You had to train alongside a knight. There was like usually an apprenticeship involved. As a young child, you would kind of like follow a knight around. You might be someone who's in charge of like cleaning his armor or taking care of him. And then you would in turn hopefully learn from him and train. So knights began competing in tournaments to train for war, where they would joust. That was kind of like an activity preparing for battle. Not really. I mean, it ends up being entertaining, of course, but and like people do it all the way up until the 1700s, 1700s. You know, like it's a while. So knights had become a part of the upper class. They were considered elite fighters and developed like a code that they all followed. So the code that they followed was known as the code of chivalry, and so they had laws, certain things that they believed and that they did as knights, knightly duties, if you will. So chivalry is the code of ethics that knights are supposed to uphold. So they're expected to defend the church, defenseless people. They're supposed to treat captives as honored guests instead of putting them in dungeons. Chivalry codes required the knight to treat the aristocratic women with tenderness and respect. So that's why we get off thinking like, oh, knights are just like your ordinary kind of like gentlemen, like they're what gentlemen should be, because they're, you know, they treat people kindly and with respect and tenderly, but also they're like hardcore fighters. It also implied that knights should fight only for glory and not for material rewards. So you're not fighting for land, you're not fighting like to brag, or well, you are fighting to brag, but you're not fighting for land, you're not fighting for money, you're fighting because it's what you do. This is what you were born to do. It's the glory of it. So this is these are some of our women. This is supposed to be. Let me get my face out of the way. So this is supposed to be like Sir Lancelot coming along to see Guinevere. And Guinevere is married. She's like engaged to another man, by the way. But Lancelot always respects her, and he understands that she's engaged and promised to another man. He just wants her to know that he respects her and that he cares for her. And so you see a lot of like artwork depicting the two of them. So most women are under the control of their fathers, like the aristocratic women anyway, until they're married. And then they belong to their husbands after they're married. Aristocratic women have a lot of opportunities to play important roles because their men are often away fighting at battles. And so if your men are away fighting, if you're married to a lord or someone who's a vassal to someone else, then typically you're going to be home alone, or you're going to be able to take care of the castle by yourself. You're going to rule the castle. Some women even advised and dominated their husbands, like Eleanor of Aquitaine. She's one of the most famous of these women. She marries King Louis the Seventh of France at 15, and then he annuls their marriage. So she marries Duke Henry of Normandy, who becomes King Henry of England, and she spends most of her time abroad. She's from Aquitaine, and so she travels to Aquitaine. She doesn't stay in England. She creates a court dedicated to cultural activities. They have 8 children. 2 of her sons are Richard and John, who eventually become kings of England. We'll talk about them more later on. You're probably familiar with them in Robin Hood. Long live King Richard. King John is like the savage of the 2 of them. So she travels around, she arranges weddings. She just has a good old time and like kind of sets the party standard until she dies in her 80s. So, way to go, Eleanor. And this is a picture of her. Lovely. Or a painting of her. So, here's the thing. The line of succession kind of changes in England with the Norman conquest. This disrupts all of history in Europe after the Battle of Hastings. So basically, William of Normandy, his father was like a Viking king, like whatever loyalty or royalty, and lived in Normandy. Normandy is Viking land; that's Daneland. And he and his army were heavily armed, and he decides that he wants to go against King Harold and his foot soldiers, and he's going to get this army together, and he's going to defeat him, and he wants to be king because he believes that he's rightful king. And so on October 14th, 1066, the year of the conquest is what they call it, is whenever he and his men go and fight and defeat King Harold and his foot soldiers. So William was crowned King of England not soon after. And the Norman kings had received parcels of land or fiefs in exchange for protection of the king and his loyalty. So William had made all nobles swear an oath of loyalty to him as the sole ruler of England. He's like, I defeated him fair and square. I'm the new ruler. If you want me, if you want to continue to live and be nobility, then you're going to have to swear your allegiance to me. And so the Normans married Anglo-Saxon nobility, and they started to merge French and English language and customs. And so you have to remember that Norman is around present day France. So they speak like a Latin French, and they're not English, they're not Anglo-Saxon. So the Anglo-Saxon culture and the Norman culture merge together and create what we know as like the English culture today that we're familiar with. So William takes a census known as a Domesday Book. It's the first census taken in Europe since Roman times. He includes people, manners, and farm animals in this particular book. Also, the English language. So William said that women and men must speak their native language. He didn't want people like switching up their language. He's like, like you're French, you speak French. You're English, you speak, or you're, Anglo-Saxon, you speak Anglo-Saxon. And so a lot of the men, because they were from France, spoke French, and the women spoke the Anglo-Saxon language. And so English is created by combining the Germanic Anglo-Saxon and the French Latin. So everyday language that we use around our friends and family would be considered more Germanic language, while whenever we're trying to sound intelligent, we may use like the French word for something. So some examples would be to ask someone. Another word for ask would be interrogate. Interrogate would be the French version. Another one, sweat. So sweat would be the Anglo-Saxon word. And perspiration is the French word. Then you have deer is the English or the Anglo-Saxon word. And then venison is the French word. And then you have angry as your Anglo-Saxon word, and discombobulated as your French word. So we have more words than to describe our thoughts in any other language on earth. We have over 600,000 words. Like no one else comes close to that. And we only use an average of 20,000 to 35,000, like in general. It's very rare that people use more than that. So just something to think about. Maybe we need to expand our vocabulary a bit. Sometimes it discombobulates me that we don't speak better English. It's fine. Yeah, I was joking. Anyway, so Henry II and the church, this is from 1154 to 1189. So Henry II is the husband of Eleanor of Aquitaine. So he expands the crown's authority during his reign as king and creates common law. He for the kingdom to follow, he replaces codes that varied from place to place. He creates a common law for everyone. This hadn't really happened before. Up until this point, different areas kind of just follow their own laws. Your kings, like I said, they're kings, but they're really more just figureheads. They don't really have very much authority because they have so many like lords and vassals underneath them that really have the authority. So anyway, King Henry II is kind of changing this up. He's like, no, we're going to follow this law. We're going to follow common law. So he claims the right to punish clergymen as well in royal courts. He's like, I'm above all. I'm above the church. So Thomas Becket, this guy who is the Archbishop of Canterbury, he's part of the church. He's one of the highest ranking English clerics, claims that only the Roman Catholic Church courts could try clerics. He's like, no. Henry II thinks he's bad, but he can't come after me. The only person that can come after me is the Pope. So Henry supposedly says, who will rid me of this priest? And 4 nights murdered the Archbishop in his cathedral in Canterbury. So Thomas Becket is killed for supposedly going against Henry II. So the church threatened his power, so he backed down and he allowed the church to remain the superior authority. But this is one of the first times that we see people start to challenge the church and the church's authority. So we'll see some changes coming on. Church superiority. It's not going to last forever, but for now. So King Henry's son, Richard, remember, becomes king in 1189. Long live King Richard. Everybody likes King Richard. He goes off to fight in the Crusades. And while he's gone fighting in the Crusades, his brother John rules in his place. No one really cares for John. John's kind of a jerk. He's a womanizer. He's just unpopular in general in history. The English nobles resented King John's power and forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215 at Runnymede. So this document, because they got so fed up with his crap and him trying to like run everything and being so ornery and not really caring about the people so much, he was just completely different from his brother, that they make him sign this document that basically forces him to recognize that the relationship between the king and vassals is based on mutual rights and obligations. It's like, just because you're king doesn't mean that you can dominate everyone and you can just do whatever you want. You have responsibilities as well. So by signing this document, it says that like he has to, kind of submit to the will of people who are nobility below him. And so it weakens the power of the king. And it forces the king to recognize that his power isn't absolute. He's not number one. He never will be like the sole ruler. And it really just kind of like places a damper on things for kings from here on out. Because this is when like people start to say like, I can challenge that. I'll challenge it. All we got to do is make him sign this document and he'll have to follow it, or we can challenge his authority if we need to. So he messes it up for everybody else. So during the reign of Edward I, England formed a parliament. So parliament is supposed to be like 2 knights from every county or 2 people from every town and all the nobles and bishops throughout England. The nobles and church lords form the House of Lords, and the knights and townspeople form the House of Commons. So this is kind of like Senate, like your lawmaking body, Parliament. Parliament is going to grant taxes, they're going to discuss politics, and they're going to pass laws. Who did this before? Just the king. So the people are starting to get more power. The king is kind of like waning back. So moving on, we're going to talk about the Byzantine Empire now. So remember how the Western Roman Empire fell in 476? Well, the Eastern Empire still existed, and it was ruled by Justinian. So Justinian ruled the Byzantine Empire starting in 572. He expanded the empire into the Eastern Romans to include Italy, part of Spain, North Africa, Asia Minor, Palestine, and Syria. So all the purple belongs to Justinian. And for a minute, the former glory that, was once the Roman Empire kind of takes, it's like here again for a small time. Okay. Like very small time. So Justinian's most important contribution was the Justinian Code. And that was like the code of Roman laws. And it's, basically the precepts of these laws are to live honestly, don't injure anyone, give every man his due. Justinian set the Byzantine capital at Constantinople. He also helped build the Hagia Sophia, which is pictured here. So the Byzantine Empire was both Greek and Christian. It was built on Christian faith, which is shared by the citizens of the empire, and the Christian church of the Byzantine Empire became known as the Eastern Orthodox Church. So the Eastern Orthodox Church is basically just another version of the Catholic Church. If you're in Western Europe, it is the Catholic Church. If you're in Eastern Europe, it's the Eastern Orthodox Church. So Constantinople was the largest city during the Middle Ages. It was dominated by an immense palace. They had like a huge complex, hundreds of churches, huge arenas where gladiator fights were still held, along with chariot races. It's like they're kind of living out the old days. Justinian also created a lot of roads, bridges, walls, public baths, courthouses, schools, churches, underground reservoirs for water. Like all around, he's a pretty decent ruler. Like puts in a lot of public works. This is one of the it's similar to the Colosseum, like one of the large arenas that they would use to do the chariot races and like the gladiator fights. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. Christianity in the Byzantine Empire was huge. A lot of Eastern Orthodox Christians had a problem with recognizing the Pope as the head of Christianity because Eastern Orthodox Christians, they're not quite the same as Catholics. And so this causes a split in the church, a schism, if you will. So the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church are still split today as a result of the schism. It's because of the Pope and like how much authority that they think the Pope should have and who the Pope, if the Pope should be the head of the church altogether. So, so like I said, in the East, you've got a Greek-speaking Eastern Orthodox Church, and on the Western side, you've got a Latin-speaking Western Church. So, from the 11th and 13th centuries, European Christians carried a series of military expeditions to reign the Holy Land from the Muslims. Why? Because it was the Holy Land. This was Jesus' land, and they thought it was their land, not the Muslims. So the Crusades began because Byzantine Emperor Alexius I asked Europeans for help against the Turks, who were Muslim. Pope Urban II basically sees this opportunity to provide leadership and rally warriors to free Jerusalem and Palestine from the infidels, aka Muslims. So Pope Urban II gets up and he's basically like, if you don't fight, then you're not a Christian. If you fight, you're going to get this like golden, you're going to get this crown. Like everybody's going, like anyone who fights or dies fighting is automatically going to heaven for this. Like, this is awesome. So basically everybody like buys in. And they're like, well, the Pope is saying like it's going to be fine. So like, obviously we should go fight. And so everybody rallies together and they start doing it. He said, all who die shall have immediate remission of sins. To which they replied, it is the will of God. So then you have a whole bunch of Christian warriors running around believing if they fought hard and died, they would be forgiven of their sins. Take up your weapons and fight. You'll be forgiven of your sins. The first crusading armies were from France. These knights were highly motivated by religious fervor, and many of them were just there for the excitement and the chance to fight. They're knights. That's what they do. They don't have Wi-Fi. They don't have, Instagram or Snapchat. They're ready to fight. Other people saw it as a way to gain wealth and gain a new title. If you fight a holy war and you do pretty well, then maybe you'll get some money or something. Other people sought new trading opportunities in the Byzantine Empire and Muslim land. So basically, yes, the Crusades are about getting the Holy Land back, but people fought for a lot of different reasons. So the First Crusade began as organized French warriors making their way east. Their army included thousands of men and cavalry and infantry. They captured Antioch in 1098, and they proceeded down the Palestinian coast and reached Jerusalem in 1099. They captured the Holy City, but there was a horrible, horrible massacre. Then they established 4 Crusader states in the east, but they were surrounded by Muslims. And so they couldn't get supplies in because they depended on Italian port cities to get in supplies. These port cities grow really powerful during this process also. Genoa, Pisa, and Venice, like they'll become like your major trading cities. We'll talk more about them in the Renaissance, after the Middle Ages. Like They're huge. So because they're surrounded by Muslims, it's hard to maintain a Christian state. If one of the states fell, they would try to call for another crusade. So St. Bernard of Clairvaux tries to call for another crusade because one of the states falls. He's like, look, we've got these 4 Christian states, but we can't keep them like forever. We need help. We need another crusade. So King Louis VII and Emperor Conrad III were enlisted to help the campaign. The Second Crusade was a total failure. Long story short, there were 3 different objectives instead of 1, and it led to disorganization. There was a lack of communication. Christians lost the city of Edessa back to the Muslims, and it was pretty much over from there. In 1187, the city of Jerusalem fell back to Muslims, and they decided to start a third attempt. Frederick, who was one of your main leaders of the Third Crusade, drowned in a local river. Literally didn't even make it across the river. Drowned in a river. They arrived by sea, and then they couldn't get out of their boats because the water was so bad because it was storming. So they just turn around and go home. Basically, they were able to negotiate with Saladin, who was leading Muslim forces, and allowed Christians free access to Jerusalem, and that was about it. So yeah, here he is. Here's Frederick dying in the river. And they're just like, oh, no. Frederick. Get Frederick. We can't get out of our boats. Turn around and go home. Yep, good times. So the Fourth Crusade, 6 years later, Pope Innocent III initiates this Fourth Crusade. So as they move east, they become involved in a fight over the Byzantine throne. So they were a commercial competitor to them, so they captured Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire was doomed from this point on, basically. After this dude, Nicholas of Cologne, announced that God had inspired him to lead a children's crusade. He said that he had a dream, and God spoke to him, and he's like, you're going to lead these children into a crusade. So thousands of children marched with him to Italy, where the Pope was like, you're kidding, right? Go home. So 2 ships full of children go down with the storm, and they all died. And then the other 5 ships sailed to Africa, where they were then tricked and sold into slavery. So here's your children marching off. None of the kids made it to the Holy Land. Moral of the story, if the Pope tells a bunch of 12-year-olds to go home and not wage war against Muslims while hiking through the Alps, go home. Final thoughts for this chapter. The Crusades benefited cities such as Genoa, Pisa, Venice, because they become important trade centers, okay? Cool. They make a lot of money. A lot of people pass through there. Eventually, it helps break down feudalism. As kings levied taxes and raised armies, nobles joined the Crusades and lost their lands and freed their serfs because they're too focused on fighting in the Crusades. Nobles lost power, and kings started creating stronger governments as a result because they didn't have to listen to their nobles anymore so much. Taxing trade with the East also provided kings a new wealth. This paves the way for development of true nation states. So we actually start to get more countries formed as a result. By the mid-1400s, Portugal, Spain, England, and France had emerged in Europe, and transportation had improved as a whole throughout Europe. We start to see a more global society forming. So the next chapter will hit the High Middle Ages, which would be the end of the Middle Ages. We'll talk more about the church and its power. We'll talk about the Inquisition. We'll talk about the plague and things like that.